Apple I used the word mafia earlier on. A lot of people don't know this, but they take 30% revenues on pretty much every new app in the store.
Yeah.
They've rejected your audiobook app multiple times. There's a rumor going around that they even delay how quickly you can release new updates of your app and delay how that reaches phones. What's your opinion on Apple and what they do and how they conduct themselves?
Well, it's as a consumer, let's start off with Apple is a fantastic company and they make amazing products. I really do believe that. I've been a Mac user since, I can't even remember, probably late 90s when I could first afford one, all the way to now, and obviously use the iPhone and Apple Watches and all that stuff. So let's start with that. And I think that's hard to square then that there's this other company that's fiercely focused on just itself and constantly trying to do things by itself and not working well with others. Those are perhaps two different sides of the same coin. But you know, the way that manifests itself, I think that it's a company in many cases that still sees itself as an underdog, but don't realize that they become Goliath. And so many of the tactics that made it the rebel kind of thing are now stifling innovation, and it's really hurting consumers to a great extent. With the 30% you talked about, with the fact that, you know, a Spotify can't, or any developer, if you don't pay the 30%, you can't even speak to your consumers. It is kind of absurd. So, you know, there's a ruthlessness on the business side of Apple. And perhaps it's always been so. I don't know. I never got the opportunity to meet Steve Jobs, but where just from an ethos point of view, it's just not me. I have a hard time squaring that with me as the consumer and me as the business leader. And needless to say, I do believe that Apple can and should play fair, and I think it would be way better for the world if they did. And I think that it would actually help them in many regards to switch their tactics and realize that they are the Goliath at this point and not David. And so, yeah.
When I heard the Spotify story, I really wanted to meet you because I consider myself to be ambitious, but there are some challenges that I would just view as impossible. And at the time when you consider how the music industry was, that it's ran by these big record labels predominantly and they own the music, to be a young kid from Sweden and believe that you could change that, for me, is a special type of delusion. It's just an impossible task. It's what I just would have thought, okay, some things are the way they are. They're immovable objects. That is one of them.
Yeah.
Why didn't you think that was a impossible task?
Well, I think for several reasons, but I think that is the beautiful naivety of an entrepreneur as well, right? We move mountains. I'm sure Elon was this, you know, even more insurmountable thing, electric cars, and there hadn't been a successful car companies for, I think, a century or something, or at least, you know, many decades in the US, and he managed to do that. So I think it's part delusion, sorry. But the other part I think also is that what I realized is, before even committing to this idea, so the why not part, I probably spent 500 hours learning about this problem. And the scarcest resource we have in the world today by far is time. And when you have high quality people that spend thousands of hours on a problem, you find new solutions. And so the biggest thing for humanity, I believe, is simply that. I believe we're capable of doing practically anything, but there aren't that many people that can see these multi-dimensional things with that right experience that happens to come in at that right time. They're spending thousands of hours of trying to, you know, needle in a haystack, see that opportunity through that very, very tiny prism. And so in the space of music, I didn't know anything about the music industry going into it. But I would argue a few years into it, I was probably one of the most foremost experts on copyright in the world, around like the DMCA and what the US copyright regime looked like, and what other regimes look like, and how performance rights societies, label rights, and what kind of rights, mechanical rights, performing rights, all of those different aspects, all the different code ISRC numbers, ISBN numbers, and how they related, and so on and so forth. I find like people either get too muddled in on the details and don't see the bigger picture, or they stay too top level picture to really see the nuance. And the question is, how do you dive deep enough where you see it and figure out which problem to solve in what order? And I was at that point by probably 2007, having spent a year on Spotify, but the team was super small, so it really wasn't a big commit at that time, and I wasn't sure at that time. But then I realized that, hey, this is actually possible, because we'd built the product that showcased the technology of what we were doing, and it felt like if you had all the world's music on your hard drive. So then the real problem ended up being, can we get the music industry to accept this? And to that, I had no idea. But I felt like this is so obviously, if this came out in the marketplace, what consumers would ask for. Now, the only question is the music industry going to allow this? And that took me another year and a half, 18 months to learn the answer. And it was completely binary. We almost died probably 4 times in that process, and ran out of money, and record companies saying, no, this is never going to happen, until eventually one day the stars aligned and we were able to launch. But that was not a given, but it felt like the right bet to make, because it was a binary outcome. Either we'd fail, the price wasn't all too bad. If we would succeed, it was clearly so that at least this would resonate very well with consumers.
Spotify goes on to be, success is probably an understatement. And I know the journey to that success had multiple near-death experiences to get there. One of the key moments I reflect on as a Spotify customer is when Apple launched their competing product, Apple Music, in 2015, I believe it was.
Yep.
And there was lots of articles saying that this would be the death of Spotify.
Yeah.
I think I was even concerned. As a very loyal Spotify user, I thought, fuck, they have all the phones.
Yeah.
They're kind of like the mafia.
Yeah.
They could just squash you.
Yeah.
Most companies, when Apple comes into their territory, shake in their boots.
Yeah.
What was it like in your office that day when Apple Music launched a competing product?
When you live in the thick of the fire, you're not concerned about the things that everyone else is concerned about. I usually say public perception lags about 6 to 12 months what's actually going on. And so in our case, we had known that Apple was going to launch something for probably the better part of a year, because they had the Beats acquisition beforehand, and we were hearing all sorts of rumors, etc., about what it was. So absolutely, you have to be worried when one of the greatest companies on earth decides to compete with you. So we were concerned about it, and we were kind of doubling down on what our positioning was going to be. So you kind of like double and triple checked whether or not you were deluding yourself into believing things to be true. And so, for instance, in our case, one of the big things, we had some strategic pillars that we were focusing on. One of them we called ubiquity, because we always knew this would eventually be the case. We thought that consumers would value the ability to work across all devices and all ecosystem. And our bet would be that any competitor we might have had would actually focus on reinforcing their own ecosystem and not care about all the other stuff. So the primary reason they were into a music service would be to make their own devices better, not to make the world's best music service. And so that's why we made such an effort of integrating into cars, integrating into all sorts of weird devices, smart fridges, whatever you might think. And so it was kind of like reiterating that, but I felt pretty good about that position and going back. And then there's always this sort of like, what if they figured out something that we just wouldn't have thought about. And I remember we were constantly talking to the product teams about this, and like, what if they come up with this? And we're literally trying this, game theorizing every possible angle on it. But I think at the end of the day, we kind of went through the 1,000 scenarios kind of thing. We knew we'd prepared as well as we could. We anticipated a certain type of product. There was this kind of 1% or 10% chance, whatever you want to quantify it as, where we'd just be wrong and they'd come up with something that widely superseded any of our expectations. But that very day, remember, we'd been preparing for that day for so long. So the first reaction was kind of them announcing it, which we expected them to do. And then seeing the walkthrough of the product and realizing that, okay, well, we prepared for this, we thought about this, etc. And so weirdly enough, as the rest of the world kind of like gasped for air, we were thinking about it, okay, well, this was what we expected. And back to that point, distribution was the amazing thing. They hadn't come up with something on the product side that we just didn't anticipate. But it was really just about distribution. And there was nothing we could do to guard ourselves against it. But we felt like we had a superior experience on the personalization side. The fact that, if you have a Windows machine and an iPhone, Spotify would work, but Apple Music wouldn't at that time. So there were many of those things that I thought had a better positioning than they had.
Was there any moments where you thought that it wasn't going to happen, i.e. conversations you had with record labels where someone very high up says absolutely no way?
Many times. I would say probably once every month or two over a 2-year period, I thought that this probably won't pan out. And it was incredibly demoralizing. I usually joke, but like in the beginning of that process, I had hair, and then in the end of it, I lost all of the hair. I probably gained 30 pounds in weight during that period of time. It was awful. But through it all, my co-founder, Martin, probably a factor of just who he is as an individual, but also probably because he didn't participate in these meetings, kept being really upbeat, kept being, an amazing support, and said, don't worry about it. You're going to figure it out. And he just kept believing in me. And then he also said a few times, when that wasn't enough, he said, don't worry about it. We'll figure out something else if this doesn't work out. It felt to me like I always had that safety net. And it was just the amount, the push that I needed to do this. And again, talking about not giving advice, but the advice that I do give to other people is to share the burden with someone. It is so important. And I know I get most of the credit for Spotify, but it is really a team effort from the Gustavs and Alex and all those people. But then also in the early days from Martin in believing in me and knowing this kind of supernatural ability that I'm going to pull it off somehow.
Love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.